Pastor Matt.
And I'm Mary Rose.
And welcome back to our podcast, Reading Through Scripture. First of all, I apologize. Last week, I had no voice, so we were not able to record. So we're picking it back up this week. And we are picking it up at Exodus chapter 19.
On the first day of the third month after the Israelites left Egypt, on that very day, they came to the desert of Sinai. After they set out from Rephidim, they entered the desert of Sinai, and Israel camped there in the desert in front of the mountain. Then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, "This is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob, and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites."
First of all, just a note, the Israelite calendar is a lunar calendar, and it makes a note of on the third new moon. So as this third new moon is happening, and historically, the year we talked about begins with the Passover. This is 3 months after the Passover, about 2.5 months after the Passover, because the Passover is kind of in the middle of the month.
Okay.
And so, what festival always happens 50 days after Passover?
The Ascension?
That's 60 days.
Oh, Pentecost?
Pentecost. And Pentecost means 50, so it's the day 50 days later. So, Pentecost was a name they gave, or a different name, for the Jewish festival of weeks, which would happen 50 days after Passover. We'll talk about the specifics of what the Feast of Weeks or Passover is later when it comes up again. But I think it's interesting to note because this festival, while it wasn't actually commanded as a remembrance of this, became associated with the giving of the law because of when it happened and when this chapter says they came to Mount Sinai, or to Mount Horeb, which is also Mount Sinai. They're two names for the same mountain. And so originally this was a festival.
Which was a festival?
Pentecost, or Weeks.
Weeks.
Yep.
Okay.
So it has to do with one of the grain harvests. We'll talk more about it later, because almost all of their festivals kind of have to do with the agricultural season. But it became associated with the giving of the law because of this dating and when it's celebrated and when they came to the mountain. I think has some tie-ins to the future, right? Because what do we celebrate happening on Pentecost as Christians?
The Holy Spirit coming down.
So the one who now writes the law in our hearts, the new law, that we live as Christians by the guiding of the Spirit and not by the letter of the law anymore. So it's kind of like this old festival now has become a Christian festival where we, again, receive this gift from God that enables us to live in his ways, but in a newer and fuller way. So I think that's just kind of a unique and cool thing that probably most people don't know.
Yeah.
Now, as they arrive at the mountain, this is a fulfillment of the promise God made to Moses in Exodus 3, verse 12. Remember when Moses said, well, what sign will you give me? How will I know? And he said, this is the sign. When you and the people come and worship me on this mountain, which I kind of think is a crappy sign, if you think about it, when you're not sure if you have the ability to do the things. But now it's been fulfilled. And it's been, and now they've gotten here. They are going to remain at Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb for almost a full year until they depart in Numbers chapter 10. So they'll be here for quite a while. And so they're camped at the mountain. And we hear immediately that Moses goes up the mountain before God. Or at least goes up to God. I don't know, it doesn't necessarily mean he has to be out of the mountain yet. But God calls to him out of the mountain. So God's presence is there. And it strikes me that God says in verse 3, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob and tell the people of Israel," which those are the same person, just the different names. But maybe it's a symbol or a sign that God was their people even when Jacob was a deceiver and when he's called. Because we know this is going to not go great for Israel, right? They're going to have some struggles with sin, rebellion after this. That God still remains their God. So I don't know if it's meant to go there, but it just struck me as I was thinking about this.
I don't really understand what you just said, but I don't understand why it's differentiating between the descendants of Jacob and the people of Israel.
And I don't know either, because it's the same person.
But I don't understand your explanation. Can you?
So maybe this is symbolizing or signifying that God was the God of Jacob when he was still the deceiver, the trickster, trying to do it on his own, when he was not following really God's ways, and after he'd been changed and made into Israel, renamed. And so maybe that also foreshadows that God will still remain their God even though they will rebel against him, as they do in the golden calf and a number of other circumstances afterwards. I don't know if that's really there, but it might just be doubling for impact, but it just struck me that...
Is it possible that, like, the people of Israel now includes more people other than just descendants of Jacob?
I mean, you do have the others from Egypt that go out with them, but I guess we haven't heard that they've been circumcised or anything else, but because that would be how you become part of the people. But maybe it's a more inclusive title. I hadn't thought about it that way. And as they get there, what does God remind them of what he's already done, right? He reminds them of past grace, because their identity starts with what God has already done. That's the trust they have in them. And now God says he's the one who has borne them on eagle's wings and brought them to himself. And so the image of the eagle, I think, is really important, right? The image of the eagle comes up in multiple other places where it's a symbol of God carrying them, right? He's the one who's brought them here. But eagles are also those who would defend their young against predators. And what had happened in the end of chapter 17, not that long ago.
The Amalekites attack them?
Yeah, and remember God, through Moses raising up the staff and through Joshua, defended them and brought them victory. So it's that reminder that he's going to be the one who fights the battles, not only against the Egyptians, but he's going to fight to protect his people. This might be a bit of a stretch, but I think we can be reminded as we hear about God bring them here to this place that God brought them to this location so he can meet with them. God likes to meet with people in very particular places and ways. So we know that God in Genesis created the garden in the east of Eden so he could be with Adam and Eve, a specific place he can be found. And after this, in Exodus, spoiler alert, he's going to create the tabernacle and then the temple, a place where his people know he can be found and be on their side. And it's that reminder for us that God still, he can be known in a lot of ways and in a lot of places. If we want to know his character, if we want to know that he's for us, he has located his presence, his mercy and grace for us in the church gathered, in baptism, in the Lord's Supper, in absolution. He comes to us very tangibly so that we can know how he feels for us. And I'm reminded of what Luther said when he was talking about he was having an argument with Ulrich Zwingli, who said that God didn't need to be present in the Lord's Supper. And Zwingli argued that, God is present everywhere. And Luther said, sure, but is he present for you in this table? Like, he's here, but you don't know how he's going to relate to you in this table. He's promised how to relate to you in those things. And another analogy I heard is that, sure, God is in all places at all times, but he's not ever in the same way. So a way you can think about this is water is all over the world in the atmosphere, right? It's in our air, but you can't drink it. You're not hydrated by breathing. if you want to drink, you need to get a glass of water. So, right, God is in all things, but is he there for you and for your benefit? And so here God has brought his people to this mountain for them and for their benefit. And then we get to a pretty important passage that kind of lays out Israel's mission in verse 5. So if they indeed obey his voice and keep his covenant, well, what are they going to be, or what are they intended to be?
His treasured possession.
His treasured possession. And then it goes on in the next verse. What will they be?
A kingdom of priests and a holy nation.
So those are pretty important things, right? So if they're his treasured possession, they're something that God has claimed as his own, as really important, as vital, as a belonging to him, and tended to with care. But it's not just for their own benefit, right? Because what does it mean to be holy? Do you remember, what does the word holy mean?
Set apart.
Yeah. So they're a nation that has been set apart so that they can be a kingdom of priests. What were priests supposed to do in the Old Testament?
They intercede for the people.
Okay.
They can approach the holy places. They make sacrifices for their sins.
Okay. So on that stuff that you're listing, they're doing a lot of representing the people before God. And then what was their role for God to the people? Well, they're supposed to make known his word and his law, right? They're supposed to make known what God has declared to them. They have the responsibility as the priest to make this known throughout the generations. And so if Israel is a kingdom of priests as a whole nation, in a sense, who are they supposed to represent before God?
Everybody else.
They're supposed to bring the rest of the world to God, or represent him, right? And plead for the rest of the nations. And who are they supposed to make God known to?
The nations.
Yeah. So this is still, in Peter, in his epistles, he'll make this claim that we, the church, now have this role. And the role of a priest is to pray for those who are not of the priestly caste. Not that they don't pray for themselves, but you're praying for the people you represent. And you're supposed to make God known to those people. So Israel had this calling as God's treasured possession that was meant to look different, to pray for the nations to God, and to make God known to the other nations by the way they lived, by the way they acted, by the compassion and mercy they had. And that's still the responsibility we have. We're supposed to make God known. And so this gives them their identity. It gives them purpose.
I was just thinking those three things are identity, security, and meaning.
Oh man, it's like they're all there, right? The eagle giving security, their identity as a treasured possession, and now their purpose.
Yeah.
It's like we've talked about these things a few times.
Just a few times.
And we just read it this past Sunday, Matthew chapter 5, verse 14 to 16, where we're called to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world. And I've been struck by this thought, and I didn't preach on it this weekend, but one of the things that we can think about is no matter what, we're going to shine. We're going to represent something. And the question is, will we shine what is a faithful representation of God to others? Or will it cause others to blaspheme his name? Or to question his character and his heart? And are we a faithful representative? And this is jumping ahead to chapter 20. Spoiler alert, it's the 10 Commandments. But I've been thinking a lot more about using the Lord's name in vain. Because that's the second commandment, is to not do that. And how that commandment is probably broken far more by our failure to faithfully represent him as those who bear his name. It's not just about what we say, but if we've been baptized in the triune name and we represent God to the world, sometimes our actions do not reflect that and lead to others not thinking well of God because of us.
So you're saying taking the Lord's name in vain means like to claim that we are gods, that we bear his name, and to not act like we do.
Yeah. And so we're supposed to forgive, and instead we hold on to resentment. We blaspheme God's name, who is the one who forgives, because we don't faithfully represent his forgiveness to others. Or we fail to pray for our enemies the way that God has called us to. Like those are challenging things for us, to be sure. And you'll hear it when we get to the Ten Commandments. We know we don't keep any of them perfectly. We don't keep the Ten Commandments. So thanks be to God, our salvation is not based on how perfectly we do it. But I've just been reflecting on like the ways in which we fall short. And the more I know God's grace, the more honest I can be about how far short I fall. And I feel like that's just another conviction I've had is it's not just about the actual words I use, but whether or not the things I say convey truth about God to others. And my life, how it conveys truth. So what's a faithful representation or imitation of God? And that's somewhat unsettling, I think, as we think about this. Talking about it this way can make this sound, or almost turn what Jesus is saying in Matthew 5 into law. And I think there's a way that we could receive it that way when we think about the places where we don't reflect and bear God's name well. But I think when Jesus says that in Matthew 5, and as Christians who are struggling to live out this life and faith, it's important to have humility and honesty about the ways we fall short, but also remember that this, in Matthew 5, is a declarative statement. You are salt. You are light. It's now who you've become, so you'll naturally do those things. I talk about this all the time, how we kind of have this identity crisis when we sing. We forget who we really are. But I think if we look back in our lives, if we reflect, there are places we fail short, but there are also places where if we look back, we'll see that our light was shining the light of Christ, that we were acting as salt and light even without thinking about it, even as we grow more and more into this calling. And that's important to keep in mind. I know I talked about in particularly the plague narratives earlier in in Exodus, how there was a lot of connections, I thought, to the creation accounts.
Yeah.
And so I think this is another place in verse 6 where we're called to be the kingdom of priests, where there's a connection. Because if the nation is meant to be a new Adam, right, a beginning of a new creation and a new man.
The nation?
Yep.
What do you mean?
Like they're called out to be in this close relationship with God.
Israel,
yep.
You mean.
And to represent him. As are we now in Christ. But
why does that make them a new Adam?
Well, because Adam, I believe, was called to function as the original king-priest model.
Okay.
To have dominion over creation, so you can see the kingly side. And I think he has the priestly role because he was supposed to make the word of God known to Eve and then to his descendants, which is the priestly function. And so then it's not surprising that if Israel is kind of this new Adam, this new beginning, that they would be a kingdom of priests. Because Adam's role was to mediate the knowledge of God to all creation, and now Israel's role is to mediate, to share the knowledge of God to all nations. And we see Israel's going to repeat Adam's failure. Adam transgressed the stipulations of the covenant that he was given. We won't notice to call it a covenant, but the command, right?
Sure.
To not eat. And was driven from the garden. And so Israel breaks the Sinai covenant, and they'll be later exiles from the land, from Israel itself later. And so we see that they repeat the failure of Adam. And so we're still in need of a faithful priest, longing for that faithful representative. So it drives us to that longing for Christ, who will come. So one more thing that's interesting on verse 6, and this goes back to kind of the Hebrew. It's unusual for God to use the word goy in Hebrew, which is the word for nation, for Israelites. Usually he only uses that when he's referring to the Gentiles, when he's speaking to Israel. But it is used in the call of Abraham in Genesis 12, verse 2, that God promises to Abraham to make him a great nation, and the nation is Goy in that. So it's talking about Abraham, him being made into a great nation. And I think that makes a connection to the promise here that their calling, the calling of Israel, is going to be for the blessing of the nations. It's not that God has called Israel so that they can be blessed for their own sake, or so that they can not care about anybody else. They've been called and given this gift to bless others, just as Abraham was called so that the people might be blessed through him. And so I think there's that connection there. Now, picking it up at verse 7. So Moses came and called the elders of the people and set before them all these words that the Lord had commanded him. All the people answered together and said, "All that the Lord has spoken we will do." And Moses reported the words of the people to the Lord. And the Lord said to Moses, "Behold, I am coming to you in a thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak with you, and may also believe you forever." So I think that's interesting that when God is, evidently the people didn't hear God speaking when he was speaking with Moses before, but he's going to speak now in the hearing of all the people. And part of the purpose is so that they may hear him speak, and that they may believe also in Moses forever. That they'll trust in Moses as the Lord's representative. So that's now the second time, at least, where we've heard of God trying to elevate Moses in the sight of the people so that they will trust in him and his word.
Is that, like, repeated happening one of the reasons we attribute these books to Moses writing them? Like, he's trustworthy?
Yeah, and I mean, God commands him in a couple different places to write these things down for the people. Obviously, we know the end of Deuteronomy is not written by Moses. That's generally consensus because it's reporting the last like 2 paragraphs is his death and going up the mountain. But the rest, there's no reason to doubt that Moses would have written it. And I mean, it seems likely that he would have had the training to write and read, having been raised up in Pharaoh's household. And so he has this skill set. And we know that God tells Moses later in Exodus 33 or 34 to write on the tablets again after you smash the first two that have the 10 Commandments and the 10 words. So we know that he writes in that scene anyways. But tradition has always attributed these to Moses, so I don't know if there's more than just that to it. But
well, I guess what I was trying to say is that, like, he's not just saying, like, trust this guy right now, but, like, trust him enough that, like, this becomes the scriptures.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, and that could be. And you know, it's interesting because it's the Sadducees at Jesus' time who hold nothing but the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, to be scripture, to be authoritative from God. The rest, they don't consider authoritative. And so they would say in one of the encounters with Jesus, I think it's John 9, but I might have that wrong, where they say, we know that God spoke to Moses. We don't know if God has spoken to Jesus. Or to this man is what they say, but referring to Jesus. And so they have this clear understanding that God literally spoke to Moses face to face and gave him these words. So, gives him more weight and authority. And Moses is unique in that sense. He's one who talked to God face to face. Picking it back up in the second half of verse 9. When Moses told the words of the people to the Lord said to Moses, "Go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their garments, and be ready for the 3rd day. For on the 3rd day the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. And you shall set limits for the people all around, saying, take care not to go up into the mountain or touch the edge of it. Whoever touches the mountain shall be put to death. No hand shall touch him, but he shall be stoned or shot. Whether beast or man, he shall not live. When the trumpet sounds a long blast, they shall come up to the mountain. So Moses went down from the mountain to the people and consecrated the people, and they washed their garments. And he said to the people, be ready for the third day. Do not go near a woman. So there's, I don't know exactly what to make of it, but I think there's something here we can glean again, that while we now, as we know, through the tearing of the veil and through the writer of Hebrews, that through the blood of Jesus, we can come near to the throne of grace without fear. So we don't have to be afraid of being struck down or smoked like they were. I think there is something we can learn about thinking about the posture we have when we come near God, that we shouldn't do it necessarily flippantly. We shouldn't take these things for granted, because being in God's presence is a serious thing. Now, we don't have to, again, be afraid, and if you feel like you're unworthy, that doesn't mean you necessarily shouldn't come before God, but we shouldn't be flippant as we draw near to God. There is still a place, while we can talk about what a friend we have in Jesus and how he's approachable, there's also still an important aspect that we remember that God is transcendent and holy and over all things and takes sin and brokenness seriously. I think that matters. And then, I honestly, maybe there's something more in here that you want to talk about, but the end of verse 15, where does that come from? Do not go near a woman. That doesn't appear to have been commanded by God beforehand. And I mean,
what's before that where it says prepare yourselves for the third day? What does that mean?
Well, God said he's going to come down on the third day. He's going to come into their presence. So they're supposed to consecrate themselves.
Oh.
So they're cleansing themselves. And so my guess is, it doesn't say it explicitly, but I'm assuming it means sexual relations here.
That's what mine says.
Okay.
Mine says abstain.
And
is that because of being unclean potentially?
Probably.
Yeah.
And I mean, we know from the rest of the law that when they have intercourse or when there's an emission of bodily fluids, they're unclean for the day.
Right.
Or until the evening and they've done ritual cleansing. So my guess is that's what it is. But that hasn't been commanded per se yet, and God didn't seem to say it. So it just seems interesting that it's added there. And we'll talk more about it, but the mountain here is kind of, I think, pictured and set up with these barriers and limitations a lot like the tabernacle and then the temple.
Right.
Right? Only certain people can go to a certain place, and we'll talk about it probably more in the coming chapters, but the elders and Aaron can go to a certain area, but only Moses goes all the way up. And so it seems like there's the distinction between the court of the people, the place where the priests go, and then where the high priest or only the one can go and only by invitation from God.
Yeah.
And so there's kind of setting up this already, I don't know if hierarchy is the right word, but set of limits within God's meeting with his people, even as he longs to do that.
What do we make of verse 13, where it's they're punished with death for touching the mountain, but they can't be touched. They have to be stoned or shot with arrows. What? People can't touch people who touch the mountain?
There's two ways I think we can think about this. So one is they're not to go in to pull them out. So just leave them there and let it be dealt with. And part of it might be that because God's presence is descending on it, that they can't come into that without consequence. Anybody else.
Well, I understand that.
And the other thing is, for why they should shoot him there, might have to do with the fact that if something is made holy, and not only here, but in the rest of the law, when something is made holy, it can't go back out. So when the priests, they're supposed to eat the sacrifices, right? Some of those in the actual temple. And whatever they don't eat, it can't go back out to anyone else. It has to be burned because it's been set apart and made holy. And so maybe by their crossing that line, they've taken on some of that holiness in some sense. And so the punishment for that, because they shouldn't have been in there, is death, but they can't be removed. It has to happen in there. I don't know. That's the best guess I have.
But, like, the way they have to kill them is, like, non-contact.
Yep.
Like, you can't kill them by touching them.
Right. Probably because now they've been set apart in some way by this. And so now the other people that have not gone across the line can't now come in contact with it because that would also condemn them, would be my guess. Because that's what happens, or is supposed to happen, if you bring the food or the sacrifices that have been offered out that were not for all the people, that were just for the priests for these particular few sacrifices. If they were brought out, then the other things were contaminated and had to be either destroyed or used. So, there's something to that. A third reason might be since they're already consecrated, and touching a dead body would make them unclean and unfit then to go into God's presence. And, again, some third day, I don't want to make too much of it, but anytime I hear a third day, I always want to think of resurrection and God's presence being manifested to the people, right? He's coming in to reveal his glory in fullness, at least that they can handle on the third day. Jesus' glory being manifested in fullness on the third day.
Continuing on in verse 16. On the morning of the third day there was thunder and lightning, with a thick cloud over the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast. Everyone in the camp trembled. Then Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was covered with smoke, because the Lord descended on it in fire. The smoke billowed up from it like smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently. As the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and the voice of God answered him. The Lord descended to the top of Mount Sinai and called Moses to the top of the mountain. So Moses went up, and the Lord said to him, "Go down and warn the people so that they do not force their way through to see the Lord, and many of them perish. Even the priests who approach the Lord must consecrate themselves, or the Lord will break out against them." Moses said to the Lord, "The people cannot come up Mount Sinai, because you yourself warned us. Put limits around the mountain and set it apart as holy." The Lord replied, "Go down and bring Aaron up with you. But the priests and the people must not force their way through to come up to the Lord, or he will break out against them." So Moses went down to the people and told them.
So I think it's weird that Moses seems to be like, well, we already told them. Why do I need to tell them again? And I don't know, if I heard the trumpet blast and God speaking out of thunder and it getting louder and louder and louder as it describes, I don't know that that's what I want to approach.
And the smoke rising and like...
There's a reason that the people are in fear and trembling as they see God's presence coming. And as they see God's presence descending. But obviously, God must have a reason. Maybe the people just, curiosity, right? Killed the cat. Maybe curiosity would have killed the Israelites if Moses hadn't warned them again and reminded them. Which, to be sure, you start having something that unsettling, maybe you forget the command that was given earlier. But it sounds like just kind of a wild scene. And we heard in verse 16... kind of this idea of the theophany, the appearance of God.
What was that word you said?
Theophany. That's the fancy word.
Theophany.
Theo, so God appearing.
You gotta say weird words slower.
Sorry. Theophany is the appearance of God is accompanied by trumpets. And this also would later be the signal for the beginning of worship when they get into the tabernacle and the temple. And it will also come, as we hear in the New Testament, when Jesus returns in glory. So God's arrival is always announced for all to know. And here in this case, the smoke, the sound, and the trembling increase as God gets nearer and nearer. So again, I can't imagine how unsettling that would have been. Some people tried to say, like, well, it's kind of like an earthquake or like a volcanic eruption. But I don't know, that maybe in some sense, but also like it does some weird things that don't sound like a volcano. It's just God's presence descending down on it, not going up. So
Right.
it's
It all kind of sounds really similar to like the end time stuff too. And like Jesus's second coming.
right. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Where the
did you
trumpet
say
blasts
that?
will announce his
Sorry.
returning glory. And yeah, everyone will know, right?
Yeah.
Because no one's gonna wonder here if God is coming down as it gets louder and louder and the smoke goes up. It's gonna be a very clear expression.
I feel like that'd be really scary for Moses in verse 20 when he has to go to the top of the mountain that's smoking and trumpets and shaking.
Yeah.
Like, hey, come on up now. That's terrifying.
But, the thing about Moses that I think becomes clear even as we go further is that the thing that Moses longs for is to be in the presence of God and for him to receive the glory, for God to receive the glory. Moses seems to be very, very much about that. But yeah, we read that everyone else comes to the mountain with fear and trembling and afraid of judgment. But Moses is considered a friend of God. And so he gets to go up. Which, granted, he's already met him in the burning bush and in some other ways that are probably a little less terrifying. I did have a question about 22 that maybe you didn't notice or maybe it didn't strike you. But it struck me as I was reading it, where it says, "Let the priests who come near to the Lord consecrate themselves, lest the Lord break out against them." But we haven't had a priesthood established yet. So who are these priests? Who is it that's doing these things? And because the priesthood isn't established until chapter 28.
But so everyone was making sacrifices?
So we talked about this, I think, before, and there's been a lot of debate about this passage, but I think that the initial intent of God was for the eldest son of every family, or the head of the family, to be the priest. And so I think maybe that's what he's talking about here, is those people that are functioning in that role. And that would kind of alleviate the issue. Because lots of critical scholars who try to say that this is put together from a bunch of other stories are like, see, they haven't even had priests established yet, and here are priests named. But I think if you think of people functioning as heads of household in that role, then it makes sense. And, I mean, I think the priesthood of Levi, of that family, is only established because Israel refuses and won't come up the way that they were supposed to later. Because they fear God, and so they want an intermediary. And so God meets them with that need by raising up the family of Levi. And then, this is kind of the first mention in a while in verse 24 of Aaron. He is supposed to go up with Moses at this point. And so, again, this kind of seems to foreshadow his role as high priest, right? When they establish it, that he's enabled to go into that more intimate presence of God and going up to the peak.
So, were the people, did the people think God was, sort of encapsulated in the mountain? Is that how they were thinking of him? The words just strike me as odd. He will break out against them.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if they thought he was in the mountain. They definitely thought, obviously, his presence was in the cloud. And, I mean, maybe breakout isn't the right word. I'd have to look closer. But I think it means, be opposed to them. So it doesn't necessarily mean that he's, going to spring out of the mountain as much as, turn against them.
Okay.
But did yours at the end of verse 19 say that God answered him in thunder?
No.
Okay. So mine just kind of supplies that God spoke to him in the thunder. Because that's one of the questions we have to ask is, did the people hear and understand the voice of God or not? Mm-hmm. When he's thundering on the mountains? Because in John chapter 12, as Jesus is coming into Jerusalem, God speaks to him, but the people hear the sound of thunder. It doesn't necessarily mean that they heard what the Father said to Jesus. So I don't know here what that is. But again, the Father's voice appears when it speaks to sound like thunder to the people. So that's just interesting anyways. We'll get back to this again later, but This is one of the reasons why Israel was not to make anything in the image of God, because they don't have an image, they only have sound. They don't see anything, they just see the cloud. They don't have an image that they can create. So anything else is a false representation, going back to what we were talking about earlier with taking the Lord's name in vain. We mischaracterize him, at least in the Old Testament, because we have nothing we can use to actually represent his form. So, anything else on chapter 19?
No.
All right. Well, we will pick it up with the 10 Commandments next week.